Imagine you have a rival cornered, guns drawn, he knows it, you know it, and in that moment he asks you for one thing, not mercy exactly, a pause. 1 week so he can bury his father before whatever happens next happens. You grant it. Maybe because you feel like being generous, maybe because the cameras are watching, maybe because you haven't fully decided what you're going to do anyway. And on the very day the funeral ends, before the dirt has even settled on the grave, he opens fire on you from across the street. That is not a hypothetical I'm constructing for dramatic effect. That is, in the plainest possible terms, what Donald Trump himself just told the world happened between the United States and Iran over the past 2 weeks. And I want to walk you through exactly what he said, because I don't think most people caught how significant this admission actually was, or how quickly it was followed by the very violence it was supposedly designed to prevent. Let's establish the timeline first, because the timeline is the entire story here. On February 28th of this year, in the opening hours of the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, a joint American-Israeli strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with roughly 40 senior officials of the Iranian state. This was, by any measure, one of the most consequential assassinations in the history of modern warfare. Not a general, not a minister, the head of a nation of 90 million people, the man who had defined Iranian foreign policy for more than 3 decades. And here's the detail that tells you everything about the chaos that followed. Iran could not bury him, not for weeks, not for a couple of months. For the better part of 4 months, Khamenei's body remained essentially unburied, caught in what multiple reports described as a state of limbo, while a government that had just lost its entire senior leadership tier tried to figure out who was actually in charge, whether it was safe to hold a public funeral at all, and who among the survivors could credibly claim the title of successor. That alone should tell you something about how deep the disruption from that single strike went. This wasn't a wounded government making a symbolic gesture of solemnity. This was a government too shattered and too afraid to even perform the most basic ritual of honoring its own dead leader. When the funeral finally did happen, it happened at a scale that matched the stakes. Beginning on July 4th, ceremonies ran for 6 days across Tehran, Qom, and Mashhad inside Iran, with the procession also crossing into Najaf and Karbala in neighboring Iraq, 2 of the holiest cities in Shia Islam. Iranian officials projected 15 to 20 million mourners would take part, which would make it, by a wide margin, the largest state funeral in the country's history. Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, had already been named the new supreme leader in the weeks after his father's death, a choice widely read as a signal that the hardline, IRGC-aligned wing of the Iranian state had consolidated power rather than the more pragmatic factions. And here's a detail I think deserves more attention than it's gotten. Mojtaba did not appear at his own father's funeral, not once, across 6 days of ceremonies. Iranian officials have said he was wounded in an earlier strike. His government has not clearly confirmed his condition, his location, or even, in any verifiable way, that he is functioning as head of state in anything but name. When a country cannot produce its own supreme leader at his predecessor's funeral, that is not a minor scheduling footnote. That is a government that may not currently have a clearly functioning head at all. Now, here is where Trump's own words become the center of the story, because this is not something journalists piece together from anonymous sources. This is the president describing it himself, in his own voice at a press conference. Trump said that Iran approached the United States and asked for a timeout, specifically so that the funeral proceedings for Khamenei could take place without American or Israeli strikes interrupting them. And by Trump's own account, the request wasn't simply about optics or dignity. Iran, he said, was worried that the United States would kill them during the funeral. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because it is remarkably candid. Not worried about symbolic disruption, worried about being killed. Worried, in other words, that a strike during the funeral itself, when Iran's surviving leadership and possibly its new supreme leader would be gathered in identifiable, predictable locations for 6 consecutive days across 5 cities in 2 countries, represented a live, credible threat to their physical survival. And separately, in reporting that surfaced around the same set of comments, it emerged that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had in fact been prepared to carry out exactly that kind of strike during the funeral window. Trump granted the pause anyway. In his own words, when Iran asked, he essentially said, "Give it to him," referring to Khamenei, meaning let the funeral happen. I want you to notice the shape of the story Trump is telling here, because it is a very specific and very self-flattering shape. He is not describing a moment of strategic caution, a careful weighing of the risks of striking a 5-city, 6-day funeral procession likely to include millions of civilians alongside senior Iranian officials. He is describing an act of personal magnanimity, a show of mercy from a man who, by his own telling, had the capability and the will to wipe out the funeral if he'd chosen to, and chose not to. That is a very useful story for Trump to tell about himself. It lets him occupy two positions simultaneously that would normally be in tension: the ruthless commander who could have ended it all in one strike, and the magnanimous statesman who held back out of some combination of decency and strategic patience. It's a genuinely compelling narrative, and I don't doubt that some version of the underlying facts is true. But here's the problem with that narrative, and it's the problem that should actually be the headline of this story rather than the mercy itself. The restraint didn't buy anything. It didn't buy a durable peace. It didn't buy an Iranian concession. It didn't even buy a full week of quiet. Within days of the funeral proceedings wrapping up, the war was effectively back on. Let me walk you through exactly how fast this collapsed, because the speed is the whole point. The funeral events concluded around July 9th and 10th, with Khamenei finally laid to rest at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad. Before that, between Monday and Tuesday of that same week, while the funeral proceedings were still technically underway across Iran and Iraq, Iranian forces struck 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The United States treated this as an unambiguous violation of the ceasefire framework that had been holding, however unsteadily, since the Memorandum of Understanding signed back in June. Washington's response was immediate and large in scale. U.S. Central Command carried out what it described as offensive operations against more than 80, and by some accounts more than 90, Iranian military targets over the following 2 nights aimed specifically at degrading Iran's capacity to threaten shipping in the strait. Iran, in turn, retaliated with strikes against American-linked military positions and regional targets across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, and Qatar, essentially expanding the theater of active combat to 4 additional countries in the span of about 48 hours. Trump himself, standing at the NATO summit in Ankara during this exact stretch, declared that the ceasefire was, in his word, over. He described the Iranian regime in a complete reversal from language he'd used barely a month earlier, calling them rational, nice, strong, and smart as scum, sick people led by sick people, vicious and violent. When a reporter asked him directly what had changed to produce such a dramatic shift in how he described the same government in the space of a few weeks, Trump's answer was almost disarmingly simple. "I got to know them," he said. So let's actually count the math on the restraint Trump is asking you to credit him for. The funeral pause was granted, by his own account, specifically to avoid striking during a roughly week-long ceremonial window. The fighting resumed by every account of the actual timeline, before that week-long window had even fully closed, with the triggering incident, the strikes on commercial ships in the Strait, taking place while funeral ceremonies were still ongoing in Iraq. This is not a story about restraint producing stability. This is a story about restraint producing, at absolute best, a pause measured in days, immediately followed by an expansion of the conflict into 4 new countries. If you're being asked to be impressed by a chess player's patience, you should first ask how the board looked immediately after the patient move. And in this case, the board looked like missiles hitting commercial tankers, followed by 90 targets struck across Iran, followed by retaliatory fire landing in 4 separate Gulf and Levant states. That is not the aftermath of a successful strategic pause. That is the aftermath of a truce that was never load-bearing in the first place. I think there's a genuinely important concept from military history that helps explain why this kept happening, and it's worth naming directly rather than leaving it implicit. It's called decapitation strategy. The theory that killing an adversary's top leadership will functionally end a conflict by removing its command structure and its will to continue fighting. It has an intuitive appeal, and it has been tried repeatedly by militarily dominant powers against weaker or asymmetric adversaries. And the historical record on whether it actually works is genuinely mixed at best and frequently counterproductive. The killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020 did not end Iranian-backed proxy activity across the region. It reorganized it under new leadership within months. The killing of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq in 2006 did not collapse the insurgency he led. It produced a leadership transition that in some analyses made the movement more resilient rather than less. The pattern that recurs across these cases is that decapitation strikes are tactically spectacular and strategically inconclusive, because organizations built around ideological or nationalist commitment tend to have deeper reserves of continuity than the removal of any single leader, however senior, can eliminate. What we may be watching right now with Iran is a live version of exactly that pattern. Khamenei is dead. Roughly 40 of his senior officials are dead, and 4.5 months later, the war is not over. It has, if anything, just expanded into new countries. Now, here's a wrinkle in this story that I think deserves real attention, because it complicates the simple version where Iran deliberately chose to break the ceasefire the moment the funeral ended. U.S. officials, speaking anonymously to reporters in the days after the strikes resumed, offered a notably different explanation for why the tanker attacks happened at all. They described the strikes on commercial shipping as the work of what they called a rogue faction of Iranian hardliners attempting to sabotage the ceasefire, rather than a coordinated decision from the top of the Iranian state. Think about what that explanation implies if it's accurate. It would mean the government of Iran, at the exact moment it was staging the largest funeral in its history and installing a new supreme leader whose own public appearances remain unconfirmed, may not have had reliable control over which of its own military factions were and weren't observing the ceasefire it had signed onto. That is a genuinely alarming possibility, and in some ways more alarming than the alternative explanation of deliberate defiance. A government that breaks an agreement on purpose is at least a coherent actor you can negotiate with, however difficult. A government whose internal factions can independently drag the entire country back into a shooting war, while the nominal leadership is literally in mourning processions across two nations, is a government you cannot reliably make any agreement with at all, because there may be no single authority capable of enforcing it. And there's a second layer of ambiguity worth flagging here, because it points toward how crowded this conflict has actually become. After the U.S. wrapped up its latest round of strikes, additional attacks reportedly continued to hit targets inside Iran, and neither the United States nor Israel claimed responsibility for them. The working theory among some observers is that Gulf Arab states, the same countries whose military bases and tanker fleets have already absorbed Iranian retaliation once during this conflict, may have launched strikes of their own, independent of Washington, as a deterrent message aimed squarely at discouraging further Iranian attacks on their territory and shipping. If that's accurate, and I want to be honest that this remains genuinely uncertain, then what we're watching is not simply a two-party ceasefire between Washington and Tehran wobbling under pressure. We're watching a multi-party conflict in which several regional actors are now willing to take independent shots at Iran, each with their own separate calculus, none of them bound by whatever understanding Trump and Iranian negotiators reached back in June. A ceasefire that only 2 of 5 or 6 active combatants actually feel bound by isn't really a ceasefire in any functional sense. It's a temporary lull that happens to coincide with everyone's schedule. All of this happened against the backdrop of open calls for Trump's own assassination at the funeral itself, which is the detail that pushed this story back into headlines this weekend. Mourners at Khamenei's burial carried banners reading, in essence, that they would kill Trump, alongside similar messaging aimed at Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Trump's response, delivered on social media, was about as maximalist as rhetoric gets in modern great power signaling. He said that 1,000 missiles were locked and loaded and aimed at Iran, with thousands more ready to follow, should the Iranian government act on any assassination threat against him. He separately told reporters he had already left standing instructions with the military that if anything happened to him, the response should be a level of destruction Iran had never seen before. Whatever you think of the rhetoric, and it is genuinely extraordinary rhetoric for a sitting American president to be using in public, notice what it reveals about the state of this so-called ceasefire. We are talking about a truce so fragile that its most senior architect is now publicly pre-authorizing a campaign of total destruction in response to a hypothetical assassination, less than 2 weeks after he was praising his own restraint for not striking a funeral procession. That is not the language of a peace holding together. That is the language of two parties that both understand on some level that the actual shooting war never really stopped. It just changed its rhythm for a few days out of ceremonial necessity, and then picked back up almost exactly where it left off. There's one more thread worth pulling here, because it shows just how many hands are now on this particular chessboard. While the funeral was still underway, Turkish President Erdogan, standing alongside Pakistan's Prime Minister, warned publicly that peace efforts in the region would fail without buy-in from regional countries themselves, and said he was closely watching what he described as Israeli attempts to undermine the American-Iranian deal entirely. That is a NATO member state, hosting the alliance's own summit within days of that statement, publicly accusing one of America's closest regional allies of trying to torpedo an agreement Washington itself negotiated. Israel's own defense minister, for his part, made no attempt to hide where he stood, saying plainly that if Israel had to go back into Iran, it would go back with even greater force than before. So, you have the United States granting a funeral pause, Iran's own factions apparently unable to agree on whether to honor it, unnamed Gulf actors possibly taking independent shots at Iranian territory once the pause ended, and a NATO ally openly suggesting that Israel wants the whole framework to collapse. That is not a two-party ceasefire under strain. That is a 5- or 6-party arrangement, where at least 2 of the parties may actively prefer that it fail. And all of this is unfolding against an oil market that spiked to roughly $120 a barrel at the height of the fighting earlier this year, and has come down sharply since, which means every additional country that takes a shot at Iran, claimed or unclaimed, is also a variable the global economy is quietly pricing in real time, whether or not any single government ever admits to pulling the trigger. So where does this actually leave us? I think the honest answer is uncomfortable, and I think it's more uncomfortable than either side's preferred narrative. Trump wants credit for a moment of mercy that, on the evidence, produced no lasting benefit whatsoever, a pause measured in days that was broken before it even fully elapsed. Iran wants to present its post-funeral strikes as either a justified response to American aggression or, more awkwardly, the unauthorized action of a faction its own government may not fully control, both of which are difficult positions to hold with any credibility at the same time. And underneath both of these competing stories sits a genuinely unresolved question that I don't think anyone currently has a good answer to. Is there actually a single coherent Iranian government right now capable of making and enforcing a deal at all? A supreme leader who cannot or will not appear publicly at his own father's funeral, a military apparatus that may contain factions acting independently of the nominal chain of command, and a rotating cast of unclaimed strikes from unnamed regional actors are not the ingredients of a state you can reliably negotiate a lasting ceasefire with. They're the ingredients of a state in the middle of its own internal reorganization, fighting a war on multiple fronts simultaneously, some of them external and at least one of them, quite possibly, internal. What happens next, I genuinely don't know, and I think anyone claiming total confidence right now is overselling their certainty. What I do know is this: a 4-month delay in burying a head of state is not a normal event. A president publicly admitting his opponents begged him not to kill them during that burial, and admitting he agreed, is not a normal disclosure. And a truce collapsing before the mourners had even finished walking the funeral route is not a normal outcome for restraint that's being sold to you as strategic patience. The kill order, in whatever form it actually took, was real enough that Iran was frightened of it and asked for a pause from it directly. Trump granted that pause and, by his own telling, is proud of having done so. but prizing a moment of mercy that bought less than a week of quiet in a war that has now spread to 4 additional countries since that mercy was granted is not the kind of restraint that ends wars. It's the kind of restraint that simply delays the next headline by a few days. Watch what happens with the Strait of Hormuz negotiations this week. Watch whether Mojtaba Khamenei makes any verifiable public appearance at all, and watch whether the multi-party, semi-coordinated nature of these strikes starts looking less like an aberration and more like the actual new shape of this war. I'll be back to walk you through it as it develops.